Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Britt, and this is my presentation over Jim Miller's article, Post-Apocalyptic Hoping, Octavia Butler's Dystopian/Utopian Vision. This article is quite lengthy and very dense, but Miller makes a lot of really great points, and I will cover just the basics. But I do recommend giving the article a read if you really resonated with this novel. Miller begins the article by stating the following. If Don DeLillo's dystopian vision is a kind of Baudrillardian negation, and Harold Jaffe's work goes a bit further by seeking to work through the dystopian via guerrilla strategies, Octavia Butler goes further still by working through the dystopian elements of the culture, as Jaffe does, and then seeking to create new myths for the postmodern age. Butler does not offer a full-blown utopian blueprint in her work, but rather a post-apocalyptic hoping informed by the lessons of the past. In both the Xenogenesis trilogy and Parable of the Sower, Butler stares into the abyss of the dystopian future and reinvents the desire for a better world. In doing so, she places herself firmly within a rich tradition of feminist utopian writing. Miller notes that utopias in science fiction written by women constitute a continuous literary tradition in the West, beginning in the 17th century and continuing into the present day. These writings by American women are particularly fertile sites for utopian imaginings, and early feminists in 19th century America often wrote critiques of the male utopias. And from 1890 to 1919, more than 30 American women wrote utopian novels depicting their versions of a better world. A subversive act, not only in publishing a novel as a woman, but a utopian novel that criticized the culture they lived in. Miller notes that by the 1960s and 70s, a flood of new feminist utopias appeared, in correspondence to the second wave of the American feminist movement. However, what is unique about the feminist utopian/dystopian stories being written today is that they contain an intersection of feminism, science fiction, utopian and dystopian thinking, and postmodernism, and these contemporary narratives are profoundly intertextual in that their striking hybridity defies easy genre categorization, and makes them effective tools with which to undermine ostensibly clear-cut distinctions between self and other, and explore possibilities for alternative and non-hierarchical definitions of gender and identity within which the difference of aliens and others can be accommodated rather than repressed. Miller cites Marlene Barr as coining the term feminist fabulation, which is an umbrella term that includes science fiction, fantasy, utopian literature, and mainstream literature that is engaged in the postmodern critique of patriarchal master narratives. Miller argues, however, that these feminist fabulation narratives are part of a larger literature of estrangement, and that the use of estrangement as a literary tactic is fundamentally utopian in that estrangement or defamiliarization is rooted in an attempt to push us toward the new, or what Ernest Bloch would call the not yet conscious. Thus, any form of literature that seeks to help us see things anew is driven by a utopian impulse, even if the work in question is dystopian. Miller notes that Octavia Butler's work is interesting, in that it exists within the tradition of feminist utopian writing and, at the same time, seeks to contest it. As an African-American woman writing within a largely white woman's tradition, her work often questions the assumptions shared by many white feminist utopian writers. In this, Butler is far more class-conscious than other utopian feminist science fiction writers, and her largely dystopian fictions challenge not only patriarchal myths, but also capitalist myths, racist myths, and feminist utopian myths. Miller declares that Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy and Parable of the Sower are critical dystopias motivated out of a utopian pessimism in that they force us to confront the dystopian elements of postmodern culture so that we can work through them and begin again. Referencing Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto, Miller highlights Haraway's discussion of the need for socialist feminism to reconstruct a politics that deals with the systems of myth and meaning structuring our imaginations, calling for a new, ironic political myth that includes the utopian dream of the hope for a monstrous world without gender, as well as other utopian aspirations for a world without racism and class domination. Haraway also claims that Butler's post-Holocaust reinvented families serve as tropes to guide us through the ravages of gender, class, imperialism, racism, and nuclear exterminist global culture. Rather than Butler's science fiction being a low genre or a form of escapist fantasy, it is more usefully read as a site of extremely important political activity. Miller cites a 1990 interview with Butler, in which Butler comments on the notion of utopian thinking, stating, "I find utopias ridiculous. We're not going to have a perfect society until we get a few perfect humans, and that seems unlikely. Besides, any true utopia would almost certainly be incredibly boring, and it would probably be so over-specialized that any change we might introduce would probably destroy the whole system. As bad as we humans are sometimes, I have a feeling that we'll never have that problem with the current system." Miller quotes Michelle Erica Green in referring to Butler's ambivalence towards utopian thinking, noting that utopia is a Greek pun that can be read as nowhere or good place. Green argues that literary utopias engage the paradox between these two meanings, straddling issues of locality, textuality, and ideology in an attempt to bridge the gap between fictional discourse and everyday life. If this is the case, Miller suggests, then utopian fiction has more to do with social, cultural, or economic critique than with imagining perfection. Miller takes a look at Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy and the dystopian utopian elements, but for the sake of time, we will be focusing on Parable of the Sower. Miller cites Frederick Jameson as noting that, quote, "One of the characteristics which makes science fiction a particularly fertile form of social critique is that it can be seen as breaking through to history in a new way, achieving historical consciousness by way of the future rather than the past. This quality in science fiction makes it a good vehicle for cognitive mapping, a new form of political art that would help make sense of the bewildering new world space of late, or multinational capitalism, by mapping our relationship to local, national, and international capital in a way that would convey the abstract reality and make it feel authentically true on a personal level." Parable of the Sower engages in a form of cognitive mapping by thrusting us into the personal reality of the main character. It is a kind of politically perceptive science fiction novel, in which Butler outlines the importance of class polarizations on a local, national, and international level, while also paying careful attention to the ways in which the equally important elements of race and gender oppression intersect with class realities. In addition to presenting us with a critical dystopia that gives us a grim cognitive map of these harsh realities, Butler also leaves us with the notion of an Earthseed community, an inspiring utopian political myth that prizes diversity, but avoids a fragmented identity politics and serves as a good model for the kind of new political art called for by Jameson. Miller goes on to discuss many elements of the future world presented by Butler, discussing the walled-off communities, the actions of the government and law enforcement towards the homeless, and the street drug pyro and the destruction it brings with it. Miller calls attention to the culmination of these elements, noting that the novel was written in the wake of the LA riots, and that it seems clear that Butler is commenting on the futility of the destruction that befell poor communities in Los Angeles in the wake of the Rodney King verdict, as local grocery stores, gas stations, and apartment buildings went up in flames, while the rich watched it all safely on TV, and the underlying problems went unaddressed. Miller notes that it was not the police or the corporate executives who pulled businesses out of inner-city LA who paid the cost of the riots, but Korean immigrants, Black and Latino small business owners, and the people who had to live through the aftermath. The Burn the Rich movement never burns the rich. It destroys the scapegoats just as much as the violence in Los Angeles did. Miller connects this with Butler's future, and the mostly Black and Latino residents of Lawrence neighborhood are left homeless or dead, while the root cause of homelessness are left unaddressed. Butler also comments on America on the national level, with her depictions of President Donner's America, where most people have given up on politicians who promise glory, wealth, and order. Miller notes that some of the national government's solution to the apocalyptic social problems include suspending overly restrictive minimum wage, environmental, and worker protection laws, leading to a new slavery where the homeless poor are turned into debt slaves. Butler comments on this in a Crisis magazine interview, stating, "Parable of the Sower was probably more serious than anything I've written since Kindred. It was an if this goes on story. And frankly, there isn't anything in there that can't happen if we keep going as we have been. That's pretty frightening when you think about it. And the horrible thing is some of them are happening already anyway. Even the things you try not to think about as part of American life. Slavery, for instance. Every now and then, it will come out that people have been held against their will and forced to do work after having been seduced by lies about good salaries and that sort of thing. In this part of the country, they're usually Hispanic. I've heard of the same thing happening to black people in the South. It's already happening. I'm talking about people who can't leave. If they try, they're beaten or killed." Miller declares that the dystopian national picture Butler paints in the novel is merely a logical extension of our present. We are confronted with a dystopian world, but one which is only 20 minutes into the future. The careful attention Butler pays to contemporary socioeconomic phenomena ensures that her novel is indeed a critical dystopia that engages in a kind of utopian pessimism. Miller makes sure to note that Butler's map of the future does not end there. In addition to sketching a cognitive map of power relations under late capitalism, she presents us with a seed of utopian hope in the form of Earthseed. This Earthseed community is a cooperative communal society based on human dignity, respect for difference, and the constant need to adapt to present circumstances for the good of the group. The group is able to overcome racial and gender divisions in favor of interdependence as a long-term survival strategy. And in this process of learning this lesson, Lauren becomes a kind of Christ figure. However, Earthseed works to debunk traditional religious hierarchical thinking and suggests a worldview based on the notion of racial reciprocity. One is free to act, but not free of the consequences of one's actions. We are all interrelated and responsible for each other. In this, we see the biggest difference between Lauren and her brother Keith. Miller states that Butler is clearly commenting on what she calls the horrifying phenomenon of how many kids raised in poverty are raised with a great contempt for caring. It is not Keith's parents who have taught him not to care, however, but the larger society whose callousness overwhelms his parents' efforts. Lauren, on the other hand, represents an entirely different response to hopelessness: compassion. This is highlighted by her hyper-empathy syndrome, making her feel other people's pain and pleasure. And Lauren notes that if everyone could feel everyone else's pain, who would torture? Who would cause anyone unnecessary pain? Miller explains that by turning profound compassion into an illness, Butler defamiliarizes our current indifference towards each other. Rather than something which needs to be healed, perhaps Lauren's syndrome is the right medicine for our present compassion fatigue. Miller concludes by stating that Parable of the Sower offers us no comforting answers, preferring instead to drag us through a world full of violence, degradation, and hate, rather than constructing a utopian blueprint. Despite this, Butler's portrayal, in all her work, of the persistence of yearning in the midst of dystopia is the face of hope in our post-utopian movement. My discussion questions for you are the following. Number 1, do you agree with Miller that Lauren's hyper-empathy syndrome is likely what kept her from following a similar path to the one Keith took? And 2, what are some examples of the intersection between themes of race, gender, and class that take place in the novel? How did this intersection shape your experience while reading the text? Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed. Here are my citations.